So it was ding ding, no change for Berkshire. This is BBC Radio Berkshire by and large, although the local elections have a couple of minor surprises. We're talking about that later in the programme, but we're welcoming back Dr Alan Renwick from the University of Reading to talk politics more nationally. Alan, do we think that actually, rather than the Conservatives winning the country, the SNP lost it for Labour?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. It's impossible really at this stage for us to know why Labour did so badly in this election and why it seems as though there was such a late swing towards the Conservatives. But the kind of number one explanation in our minds at the moment is exactly what you're suggesting, that a lot of people in England were just frightened by the prospect of a Labour government that would be kind of controlled by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP.
Which did become a real central plank, it seemed, of the message the Conservatives were trying to get across. If you vote Labour, you're voting SNP.
Yep, they campaigned very hard on that in the final weeks of the campaign, and it looks as though that probably got through. Certainly, kind of anecdotally, the sorts of things people were saying on Thursday, on Friday morning, it does sound as though quite a lot of people were frightened by that message.
Now, we've spoken to lots of people over the weeks and even months leading up to the general election, and it didn't seem to me, purely anecdotally, that people were shy of telling us if they were Conservative supporters. But this shy Tory thing now also seems to be emerging, that people maybe said one thing to the pollsters, who maybe have some explaining to do, and then did another thing when they were in that booth. Do you think the shy Tory phenomenon is significant in any way?
Well, there are two possible explanations for what happened and the difference between the polls and the final result. One is that people were telling the pollsters porkies, and the other is that they just changed their minds between when they spoke to the pollsters and the final result. We don't know which it is, really. I suspect it's more that people were changing their minds because, you know, the exit poll, which was done after people had voted, got it more or less right. So people weren't being shy about admitting how they voted in that. So probably it's more that people did actually change their minds just at the last moment.
I take your point absolutely there, because the Daily Mirror yesterday, the Mirror, of course, traditionally a Labour supporting paper, had a black front page, something along the lines of 5 more grim years, and they predicted from their exit polls 316 seats for the Conservatives. Now, that would not have given them an outright majority. They have got an outright majority, and as you say, people on the way out obviously told the truth because they'd finally made their mind up.
Yes, exactly. So the exit poll, the BBC exit poll that came out at 10 o'clock on Thursday evening, like the Daily Mirror's estimates, didn't show an overall majority for the Conservatives, but it was pretty close. And when you're trying to predict seats all over the country, 650 different seats, it's really difficult to do that accurately just on the basis of an opinion poll. So the exit poll was surprisingly accurate, really. Whereas all the polls previously, as we now know, they didn't accurately predict the result, but they might well have been accurately predicting what people were saying and thinking at that time.
You're hearing the voice of Dr Alan Renwick here on BBC Radio Berkshire. He's a doctor, not a medical doctor, so I can't show my verruca, sadly. He's an expert in politics from the University of Reading, and it has, of course, been a very dramatic 36 hours in British politics. The Conservatives have achieved their first general election win for more than 20 years. Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage have all resigned as party leaders, and the SNP has become, for the first time, the third biggest party at Westminster. Here's how it unfolded.
Quite remarkable, this exit poll. The Conservatives on 316. The Liberal Democrats on 10.
If this exit poll is right, Andrew, I will publicly eat my hat on your programme.
The election has profound implications for the country. It also obviously has profound implications for the Liberal Democrats.
Cameron David William Donald, 35,201.
I don't think we need any fancy constitutional experts to tell us what they were trying to say. I think they have decisively rejected any attempt to take this country back to the 1970s.
Alex Salmond, Scottish National Party, SNP, 27,700.
The Scottish lion has roared this morning across the country.
Even a majority Conservative government cannot ignore what happened in Scotland yesterday. There has been an overwhelming vote for Scotland to have a louder voice in Westminster and an overwhelming vote against continued austerity.
It's proven hard to turn round years of difficulty with the Scottish Labour Party in just 5 short months. Tonight, Scotland has lost so many great members of Parliament from all across the country.
In Scotland, we've seen a surge of nationalism overwhelm our party. Now, I want to say to all the dedicated and decent colleagues in Scotland who have lost their seats, and I'm deeply sorry.
Any personal disappointment I have is as nothing compared to the sense of sorrow I have at the result that Labour has achieved.
I've just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, and I will now form a majority Conservative government. I've been proud to lead the first coalition government in 70 years. It laid the foundations for a better future, and now we must build on them.
Clearly the results have been immeasurably more crushing and unkind than I could ever have feared. For that, of course, I must take responsibility, and therefore I announce that I will be resigning as leader of the Liberal Democrats.
I intend to take the summer off, enjoy myself a little bit, not do very much politics at all, and there will be a leadership election for the next leader of UKIP in September, and I will consider, over the course of this summer, whether to put my name forward to do that job again.
I've done my best for nearly 5 years. Now you need to show your responsibility. Your responsibility, not simply to mourn our defeat, but to pick yourself up and continue the fight.
It's all been the clever people trying to get the right magic wand to get us into power, rather than assessing what do we stand for, who do we represent, how do we persuade people.
We can take these islands with our proud history and build an even prouder future. Together, we can make Great Britain greater still.
On a professional level, I express today a degree of disappointment. On a personal level, I feel an enormous weight has been lifted from my shoulders, and I've never felt happier. Thank you.
Wow, what a week it's been. And in Berkshire, no seats changed hands with the Conservative MPs in all our constituencies except Slough, which was held by Labour's Fiona McTaggart, in fact. Labour also saw success on a local basis, holding on to Slough and Reading borough councils. Jo Lovelock is the leader of Reading's Labour-run borough council. She says the party's lack of success in Parliament has not been replicated in her own authority.
Clearly, whatever happened in the last few days is something that turned it into a less successful night on a parliamentary level, but locally we are very pleased with what we've been able to achieve.
It's BBC Radio Berkshire, and that was Jo Lovelock we're hearing from there from Reading Council. In Basingstoke, where there's been no one in overall control of the council, the Conservatives secured 16 seats out of the 21 being contested this time around to take a majority at Basingstoke and Deane Borough Council. The result saw 2 Tory gains, left Labour with 2 holds and a gain, and the Lib Dems holding on to their 2 existing seats. All our other councils remain unchanged, with Bracknell and West Berkshire remaining Conservative and Wokingham beginning their count in the next hour. So good luck to anybody listening who's heading for Wokingham to help with that count. We're now joined by the BBC political correspondent, Peter Henley. Good morning, Peter. Peter, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. And hello.
Now, there's the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, very interesting nationally. What do you make of the local election results, first of all? No real change in Reading and Basingstoke.
Well, and the same at the parliamentary elections as well, to the extent that when you say no change, the fact that Labour weren't able to take a seat in Reading West is in itself significant, isn't it? You know, they've invested years of work. Individuals, Victoria Grulef, the candidate there, has worked with community organisations to try and get rid of the Conservative Alok Sharma. He has fought back. He's obviously in Parliament, done his job, but also campaigned for the Conservative principles. And in the end, the Conservatives have won the day. So when you say no change, that doesn't reflect, you know, the huge struggle, the number of doors knocked, the pamphlets written and delivered, the strategies worked out, as you heard in that clip there, the clever people trying to change the person at the top, the person who is the MP for Reading West, who goes to Parliament to represent 50,000 odd people. So, you know, it's been, for all of us who've been up all night and who've followed this for weeks and months, it's been a fascinating result. The power of the ballot box in the end. Yes, it leads to no change, but it doesn't. That will set everybody back in those parties. All these resignations. It's about a new direction, a new leadership, a lot more thought about what it is that people are telling us about how they want the public services that we rely on to be delivered. So, yeah, an interesting time.
In fact, we're talking a little later in the programme to the last Labour incumbent of that Reading West seat to find out what he thinks, what in his opinion happened this time around.
Yeah, Martin Salter, that will be fascinating.
Now, there's also been comment made this morning that perhaps some people voted, certainly in the south of England, along the lines of Hilaire Belloc's cautionary tale, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse. And the worst may have been SNP and Labour in coalition.
Yeah, the SNP weren't going to come and take over Pangbourne, but people sort of felt that way, didn't they? You know, they didn't like the idea of Westminster being dominated by the hairy Scots. And I might be being very prejudiced in saying that.
I say, Nicola Sturgeon is far from being the bearded lady of British politics.
That was a sense of the feeling, though, wasn't it? I mean, and the long-term economic plan that we just got so fed up with David Cameron talking about day after day after day for years, that I think in the end got into people's consciousness, and they thought, you know, do we want someone else taking the controls, the levers in the Treasury, changing our taxes, changing the way that money is spent in particular? I mean, on the NHS, yes, Labour were hitting a nerve, and people cared deeply about having free healthcare for them and their families. But David Cameron answered a lot of those points. And the idea that he should be allowed to continue, actually, even he, I think, didn't really expect, certainly looking at the polls, that he would be in the position he is now, of able to just implement what's in the Conservative manifesto without having to compromise it with all sorts of other people. And maybe, you know, people voted conclusively not for a different system of voting. People voted when we had a referendum some time back not to have the alternative vote system. And first past the post does what's on the tin. You know, we have now got a lot of people who got first past the post in Scotland going to Parliament. But we haven't got the teaming up with Labour in some sort of slimy backroom deal. And I think certainly the Liberal Democrats have suffered at that. You know, I mean, people will feel sympathetic, but that's what people voted for in the referendum, not to change the voting system.
Peter, thank you for joining us. I'd love to get a shot of that slimy, darkened room, back room that all the politicians were talking about, certainly on the question time before the election. Thank you, Peter Henley, BBC political correspondent, talking to BBC Radio Berkshire. And here with the headlines on BBC Radio Berkshire, it's Sam Clayton.
David Cameron has reappointed Maidenhead MP Theresa May as Home Secretary and George Osborne as Chancellor as he decides on his first fully Conservative cabinet. In the local council elections, the Conservatives have taken over Basingstoke and Dean, but there's been no change in Berkshire, with the Tories picking up seats from the Lib Dems and UKIP in Bracknell and Windsor and Maidenhead. And beacons have been burning through the night, the first of which was lit at Windsor Castle to mark 70 years since the UK achieved a victory in Europe. A number of events will take place later.
BBC Radio Berkshire.
Berkshire News and Berkshire Stories with Paul Ross.
Be part of it.
It is BBC Radio Berkshire in conversation this morning, unpicking the details, the election results with Dr Alan Renwick from the University of Reading. Good morning again, Alan.
Morning, Paul.
Now, we heard mention there of the Tories manifesto, and they are now in a position to implement that. One thing they were very, very keen to underline was the referendum on the EU membership and continued membership of the EU after discussions and renegotiations. UKIP also used that. All parties mentioned it. How important do you think that was in the end to the electorate?
Well, I think the immigration issue is what matters to a lot of voters. The opinion polls suggest that people don't care terribly much about the details of the European Union, but what people do care about is levels of immigration. And, you know, many people are very concerned about what are perceived to be high levels of immigration, both from the European Union and from outside. So David Cameron, in his negotiations with EU leaders, other EU leaders over the next couple of years, will be trying to extract some kind of concession from them on the freedom of movement of people around Europe, in order that he can then go to the British people in this referendum. You know, he wants to stay in the EU. He doesn't want Britain to leave the EU.
And of course, there's every chance we as an electorate may agree with him, and it may put paid to the debate for possibly a generation if the vote is a yes to stay in Europe.
And that's what he's hoping. So he's hoping that he can get some kind of deal that he can put to the British people and say to them, I've got a better deal for you from Europe. Now vote to stay in this EU with a reformed relationship. And he will try to keep the bulk of the Conservative Party behind him on that. Some people in the Conservatives will certainly argue to go out of Europe, so it will be quite difficult for the Conservative Party. But he'll try to make that argument and hope to win that referendum in 2017.
Thank you, Dr Alan Renwick there from the University of Reading. And the leader of the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, of course, has issued Mr Cameron a stern warning that he cannot expect it to be business as usual in Scotland. Now, her party has a significant number of Westminster seats. They are, in fact, the third largest party now in Parliament. The two leaders held a brief conversation in the hours following the election, which saw the SNP become the third biggest party. They have 56 MPs. Ms Sturgeon said her message was plain and simple.
I made it clear that his government cannot act as if it's business as usual in Scotland. Scotland voted for change, it voted to have its voice heard. Now, I hope to meet with the Prime Minister in the not too distant future when we can discuss how we're going to take some of these issues forward.
We can now speak to the BBC Scotland reporter Andrew Kerr. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Paul.
So a big sea change in Scotland. What's the mood there?
Yes, Paul, actually quite unbelievable in a way when you look at it. When you look at the sheer number of SNP MPs, I know the UK polls were totally out in this election result, but here in Scotland they were suggesting that SNP would do remarkably well, and my goodness, they did. Nicola Sturgeon was down in London for the VE Day commemorations yesterday. She had that brief conversation with the Prime Minister. And this means that there's a real force, a real Scottish force, essentially, maybe holding the Prime Minister to account. An ideal result might have been a weak Ed Miliband for the SNP. The ideal result might have been a weak Ed Miliband with the SNP trying to force deals upon him. But now there's a very strong Conservative Prime Minister, so the SNP will just have to keep pushing him. But we're hearing, of course, that the Prime Minister wants to govern as a one-nation Conservative. He wants to do the best for the whole of the UK. And I think the SNP will try to work with him in a kind of polite way, and they'll try and get as much as possible out of him, but before causing too many problems.
Although, of course, one of the concerns there might be for the SNP that Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond before him have been very antagonistic towards the Conservatives, and Nicola Sturgeon said rather famously, vote for us and we'll keep the Conservatives out. So it's difficult to see, well, it's possible because Scotland built the Forth Bridge, but they're going to need some bridge building skills to make that work.
Yes, they will do. And, you were just talking about the referendum, the EU referendum there. My goodness, this will be an interesting one, because if England votes to leave the European Union, but Scotland doesn't actually vote to leave the European Union, well, Nicola Sturgeon has made this quite clear that this is a material change in circumstances, and that could lead to another Scottish referendum on independence. So this will be a really big thing over the next couple of years, just to see how that works out. And of course, some people will say, well, the SNP are looking for any excuse to gain independence. That, of course, is a reason for being for the entire party. But I think Nicola Sturgeon will just spend a couple of years at least just trying to play it carefully. But of course, she's got all these new MPs, all these new people, many new party members, and their reason for being is they want independence.
Now, when we look at the election results, Alex Salmond said the lion has roared. Labour, of course, is licking its wounds. 1 seat for the Lib Dems, 1 seat for Labour, 1 seat for the Conservatives. How on earth can Labour bounce back? What are the experts saying there?
Yes, it's really difficult now. Ed Miliband, of course, stood down yesterday. The Labour leader here in Scotland, Jim Murphy, he's only been in the post for 5 months. He says he's not stepping down. He wants to stay. He wants to finish the job. We've got the Scottish parliamentary elections next year. He says he wants to be First Minister of Scotland. Don't think there's much of a chance of that happening just now. But for Labour, it's this huge crisis. They don't know how they can go about regaining that lost vote. They talk about pickpocket politics, the SNP stealing their clothes and essentially taking on their ideals and presenting them to the Scottish public. Labour are just left high and dry at the moment here in Scotland. I'm not sure they'll find a way out of it, in the next few years at least.
Thank you for joining us. That's BBC Scotland reporter Andrew Kerr talking to BBC Radio Berkshire. And listening to that is Dr Alan Renwick from the University of Reading. It is difficult to see how on earth Labour can build on what has been an absolutely devastating election for them in Scotland.
Yes, and not just in Scotland, really. But in Scotland, I think they really need to form a separate Scottish Labour Party. Scotland has increasingly been moving away from the rest of the UK in many ways. And certainly the SNP seem to have a harder left agenda than the Labour Party. Yes, and that reflects how Scots think about politics in many ways. You know, they tend to prefer a more left-wing way of doing politics. And the lesson that English Labour is likely to draw from this result, I think, is that they need to move in a bit more of a Blairite direction. They need to occupy that centre ground where you can win elections in England. But that's not where you win elections in Scotland. So I think in order for Labour to be able to rebuild in Scotland, they're going to have basically have two separate parties, a Scottish party and a party for the rest of the UK, with somewhat different policies.
I'm afraid I am to economics what Woodrot is to Pinocchio, but I was intrigued by this notion that the Conservatives, or some Conservatives may have floated already, about fiscal independence for Scotland, because I think that might be a double-edged sword for the SNP. They may have problems if they're given the right to actually run their own economy, because a lot of it is still bolstered by the rest of the UK.
Yes, and the Conservatives have been curious. They were always traditionally the party that opposed devolution of
And now
powers
all of
to
a
Scotland.
sudden, go on lads, try and balance those books.
Exactly. They're just saying to Scotland, well, if you actually had control over the money that you're spending, then you would discover that life would be a little bit more difficult, and that you would have to play the sort of game that the Conservatives are
Which
arguing
is
the UK
cuts and
has.
austerity, which of course Nicola Sturgeon has been able to say we're not going to have in Scotland, we're against this. Now she'll have to accept it because the Conservatives have that overall majority.
Yes, so the Conservatives have said that what they will do is implement the recommendations of this commission, the Smith Commission, that brought together the representatives of all the parties and made recommendations for further powers going to Scotland, not full fiscal autonomy, so not having complete power over all the taxes in Scotland, but having a lot more power. So it would be surprising if David Cameron moved even further than that. But you never know. He might decide to basically call the SNP's bluff on this one.
Fascinating stuff from Dr Alan Renwick there from the University of Reading, talking to BBC Radio Berkshire. I'm Paul Ross with you all the way until 11. We're talking politics locally and nationally, and you'll kind of work out the reason why. But we've also got on the way on the show a little later, gardening info for you. And now what's on free for, what's on and where to go in the Royal County this weekend. If you've got an event that you want mentioned on BBC Radio Berkshire, give us a call now, 0345 900 1041.
BBC Radio Berkshire with Paul Ross.
It is BBC Radio Berkshire. I am Paul Ross, and thankfully I'm not alone. Joining us in the studio, Dr Alan Renwick, the man who was the political Batman to Andrew Peach's Robin on that big night, that night of nights, as the results came in and things changed. Because across the country, the Liberal Democrats are still reeling after a monumental defeat in Westminster. Many of the big names in politics ending long careers. Here in Berkshire, the Conservatives have made gains in all our local authorities, gaining control of Basingstoke and Deane, remaining in charge of Bracknell, Windsor and Maidenhead and West Berkshire. The latter has come at the expense of Lib Dem seats. And one of those is in the Greenham ward, where Julian Swifthook had been a councillor for 15 years. Julian joins us live now. Good morning, Julian, and commiserations.
Good morning, Paul, and thank you very much. I feel I'm in good company with the likes of Mr Hughes and Mr Cable, but sad nonetheless.
And also Mr Ed Balls.
Well, yes, indeed. Someone with whom I didn't quite see politically eye to eye, but nonetheless somebody very highly regarded in politics. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are very, very highly regarded who are now lost to the nation's government. And I only hope that the incoming government are going to be able to deliver the same.
I mean, it must be inevitable when there's such a huge swing against a councillor's party. They will suffer locally as well. Do you think there's any sense in which the Conservatives have been applauded and rewarded for the coalition's successes, and the Lib Dems have been blamed for any of its failures?
I think that's exactly what's happened. At a national level, that's exactly how things have played out. And unfortunately, the achievements of the Lib Dems in government have really been overlooked by the electorate, and it's been an election all about fear, unfortunately, in the south of England, fear about what's going to happen if the SNP were to go into any kind of arrangement with Labour.
We're a new party,
And in fact, we've also got, though, as well as fear, I suppose it could be argued that the economic success, which has maybe dipped a bit over the last 3 months, but the economic success of the coalition, people ascribe to the Conservatives. I mean, it wasn't too long before Ed Balls stopped making that flatlining gesture about the economy in the House of Commons because things were picking up. And so maybe there's a sense in which it's the economy, particularly in the South, it's not so much fear, that's people's concern and hope.
No, I wouldn't agree. I mean, it's certainly true that the economy has picked up. and that is in no small part due to the Liberal Democrat influence in government. Unfortunately, though, I don't think that's what this election has been based on. I think it has been based on the Conservatives trying to frighten everybody into what might happen if the SNP started to rule in coalition with Labour. So,
okay, let's drill down.
But I mean, that's the national picture.
Yeah, let's drill down into your work locally then, if we may, Julian.
Yeah, absolutely.
What might be your concerns now about the future of Greenham Commons, something that's been very close to your heart for the past decade and a half?
I don't see that what's happened is going to affect that particularly. I'm still involved in Greenham Parish Council, and I'm still leading the project to refurbish the control tower. That hasn't changed. What has changed, of course, is the number of Liberal Democrats that are able to face up to the Conservatives on West Berkshire Council. There are now 48 Conservatives and 4 Liberal Democrats. I'm pleased that one of those Lib Dems is still in Green, and my colleague Billy Drummond was successful. But what it means is the opposition to the Conservatives on the local council is now almost non-existent. It was not big before, but it's now even smaller.
So do you feel in any sense then, Julian, you're the victim of a public of voters who don't really distinguish between local and national issues, and in fact the local side of things becomes increasingly irrelevant?
That's a difficult question because, yes, we are definitely the victims of the fact that there have been 3 elections on the same day, and that's been totally unique. Never before have there been 3 elections taking place on the same day. And because of the national picture, yes, I absolutely agree that locally we have suffered. But the opportunity to come back is there. We are going to regroup, reform, and we will continue to provide the best alternative for the residents of West Berkshire going forward. Of that, I'm sure.
And finally, from your colleagues locally, your colleagues in the area, I mean, you can almost choose the Lib Dem leader by going eeny, meeny, miny, mo, as there are only 8 possible contenders. Do you have a favourite? Who would you like to see lead your party?
It's difficult to say at this stage. There are, as you say, not that many people to choose from, but Norman Lamb is the person that I have got my eye on, I have to be honest.
Thank you, former Health Minister, of course. Thank you very much there, Julian Swifthook there, former Greenham Ward councillor. He's been there for 15 years. He was wasn't voted back in the elections, the local elections, which happened, of course, on Thursday. Thank you, Julian. Also with us, Dr Alan Renwick from the University of Reading, political expert, of course. The coalition, I suppose, was always going to be more of a problem for the Lib Dems than it was for the Conservatives. The Conservatives could say, I suppose, perhaps with some justice, look, we were held back from doing X, Y and Z, but they weren't really forced to do anything much, were they? They weren't forced to go against any of their manifesto pledges.
Yes, I think that's fair, and it is generally the case that when you have a coalition government, the parties in that government suffer electorally, and particularly it's the junior party that suffers. We've seen it in Germany before, we've seen it in New Zealand before, so it was always going to be really, really difficult for the Liberal Democrats to manage to maintain their support in this election, but they never expected they would be crushed. They were utterly crushed in this election. You know, going from 57 MPs down to 8 MPs is far worse than any of them were expecting. And the future of the Liberal Democrats, therefore, is going to be very, very difficult.
Thank you, Dr Alan Renwick, for the moment. And UKIP also got far fewer seats than had been expected nationally, and that picture was, of course, repeated in our local councils. In Slough, Labour have remained the biggest party. They have 32 councillors, with Diana Code now the only UKIP representative on Slough Council. The former leader of the Tory group defected in January, saying she could not support David Cameron. She told BBC Radio Berkshire's Chris Browning she is still proud of what they've done in the town.
We're a new party, we're a small team, and we still did fairly well, and I'm not sad, and I'm not sad that I've joined UKIP. I'm with a party where there's no whip, where I can vote according to my conscience, where I can bring the uncomfortable debates to the table, and I'm proud that we're standing up for the people of this country.
With Andy Mellor gone, though, that does leave you as the sole UKIP voice and makes your life quite difficult over the next 5 years. What's the plan? What are you going to do?
Well, you can't do anything until the Labour majority in Slough changes. You can't actually do anything, but you can highlight, expose, ask questions and probe and carry on doing and work for the people of Slough, which is what I've always done and which Andrew did, and I'll carry on.
And can I just ask you about nationally for UKIP? A bit of a disaster, wasn't it?
No, 4 million votes. On those votes in the European, we ended up the largest party. It's because we've got first past the post. If we had proportional representation, everybody's vote would count and we would be a larger, much larger party. But while we've got first past the post in this country, that's how it will continue and your vote won't count. And I'm afraid the larger parties ran a very negative campaign, Conservatives and Labour. If you vote for UKIP, scare tactics, you'll get this, you'll get the SNP, you'll get this, that and the other. They ran a negative campaign instead of, as we did, a positive campaign on our policies.
And are you sad to see Nigel Farage step down as leader?
I'm very sad, but I think he's been brilliant. And, you know, he may well decide to run for the leadership, which, again, every person in UKIP will have a say on who we want to be our leader. So, personally, I know him very well, so I am sad, but he's also, we're all tired, everybody, you know, you're tired, you know exactly what it's like. So, yeah, it's a sad day, but as I say, 4 million votes nationally, that's not to be sneezed at.
Chris Browning there talking to Diana Coe, the only remaining UKIP representative on Slough Council. The Conservatives made big gains in Slough, stealing 2 Lib Dem, 3 West Windsor Independent Group and 2 UKIP seats, as well as 1 Independent. And that was the seat held until Thursday by Wisdom de Costa, who also lost in his running to be an MP on Thursday too. So a kind of double whammy of disappointment for you, Wisdom. How are you feeling? Welcome to the BBC Radio Berkshire.
Good morning, Paul. Good morning, listeners. Yes, disappointed, absolutely. But I have to say that in terms of the parliamentary campaign, it was a great process. I learned an awful lot, and I think as Adam Afriyie himself said, by the end of the campaign, you knew exactly what you were doing, and you gave us a run for our money, but of course it was too late to move the voters by then. Locally, yes, disappointed because on the council, as your previous callers have said, there is now virtually no opposition and certainly no credible, if you like, contrast to and scrutiny.
And do you feel guilty at all? Do you feel guilty in retrospect, or maybe even blame yourself in retrospect for standing for Parliament as well as for the council, because you only lost your council seat by a very few votes? Maybe if you hadn't split your attention and your energy, you might be on the council, if not in Westminster.
That's a very fair criticism, and I have to take one on the chin as the person who was leading the line. Yes, absolutely. I do wonder what might have been if I'd focused purely on our local residents.
So you're down, Wisdom. Are you out? Would you stand again in 5 years' time or sooner if an election is called?
If a mandate, if I was asked to do so, absolutely. You know, what I believe in, what I've always done all my life.
As an independent, though, Wisdom, who would ask you? It's a question you can answer yourself, surely.
It's not, because knowing lots of people now, having helped a lot of people ask me. I've had lots of comments and support online already. People are very, very distressed that the Conservative juggernaut has swept through, you know, on a national agenda.
And what kind of things were people saying to you when you were out campaigning locally? What were their concerns that maybe the Conservatives aren't addressing on the council?
Oh, well, the concerns are pretty much the same. They're really worried about privatisation, the way the leisure centres have gone, the way the new contract for the leisure centre really hasn't been looked at properly by the Conservative administration, which has resulted in a loss of services and an increased cost to the council, or increase compared to their budget. They're also worried about the way in which roads haven't been looked at and repaired properly. So some of them are pretty much the same things, and also concerned about some of the comments in the Conservative literature, which talks about the extended budgets for repairing roads, when in reality the road budget is going down next year. So there is concern. There's also concern about the planning laws locally, that's more of a national issue, which I would have been happy to take up in Parliament. Just the way in which laws which would have protected communities in the past have been swept away, and effectively developers' builders' charter put in place. So I fought, as you know, as Andrew Peach knows, strongly to try and help limit the presence of addictive property terminals in and near schools and near churches. So those are the sorts of things which people are really worried about.
I'm sure we'll speak again. Thank you for joining us this morning. Wisdom de Costa there, who lost his running to be an MP on Thursday, also lost his seat on the council. It's just gone, in fact, 9:15. It is BBC Radio Berkshire. I'm Paul Ross, and with me Dr Alan Renwick from the University of Reading, political expert who spent a lot of time with Andrew Peach in the week, so he must be exhausted. Alan, welcome back. We heard earlier from Diana Coe, the only remaining UKIP councillor on Slough Council, and she made the point, which a number of people have raised, about the number of votes that UKIP got in particular compared to, say, the SNP, and then the huge disparity in the seats. I mean, certainly I think UKIP got well in excess of 3 million votes, just one MP.
Yeah, so UKIP were just under 4 million votes under, only one MP, whereas the SNP, with their 1.5 million votes, got 56 MPs. So
people might be forgiven for saying that's unfair. Let's talk again about proportional representation.
It's very clearly unfair. There are, of course, arguments in favour of the system that we have as well. So the key argument is that our system produces stable single-party majority governments, which many people would argue produces more accountable government and perhaps even better quality government. So there are arguments going either way on that, but people will certainly argue, particularly in UKIP, particularly in the Lib Dems and the Green Party as well, that this is an unfair result and there should be change. However, the Conservatives now have a majority. They have won with this system. They have benefited from the system. There's no way they're going to change it.
And the SNP have benefited, now the third largest party, so while they may have questions and try and take some kind of moral high ground on this, in fact, they're also probably going to stick with it.
Yes, and Labour as well. Although they have been defeated, they actually have a higher proportion of the seats than they got in terms of votes, so they're not going to argue against the system as well. So, you know, the dominant forces within Westminster are very happy with this electoral system.
And let's not forget the public, that's you and me, voters, rejected that AV referendum not so long ago.
Yes, 68% of voters voted in 2011 against changing the electoral system, and even more, about 3/4 of voters, slightly more than that actually, voted for those parties that benefited from first past the post. So I don't think there's going to be any strong popular pressure for changing the system.
Thank you for the moment, Dr Alan Renwick on BBC Radio Berkshire.